Good morning, everyone. My name is John Bonifaz. I'm the president of Free Speech for People. We are co-lead counsel in this new federal lawsuit filed on behalf of the legal women voters and individual voters in New Hampshire. And we have as our speakers today, Courtney Hostetler, senior counsel at Free Speech for People, Mark Herring, former two-term Virginia Attorney General and counsel with Akin, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, which is our co-lead counsel, along with our local counsel at Preti, Flaherty, and Selena Stewart, chief counsel and senior director of advocacy and litigation at the Legal Women Voters of US. So we'll start off with Courtney. Thank you.
Thank you. It is an honor to be here. It's an honor to represent the League of Women Voters and our three individual clients, and of course, an honor to be working with our co-counsel on this case. As John mentioned, today we filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court of New Hampshire seeking to stop the kind of deceptive, intimidating, and threatening robocalls that were made to thousands of New Hampshire voters just before the New Hampshire primaries. No eligible voter should have to question their right to vote. But that's exactly the position that the defendants in this case tried to put New Hampshire voters in. And they did so using cheap, readily accessible technology to deceive voters into thinking that it was President Biden himself who was telling people not to vote, and to deceiving voters into thinking that the call was coming from a trusted political figure in New Hampshire. So we have sued the three parties responsible for these robocalls, Steve Kramer, and then two corporations, Lingo Telecom and Life Corporation, who were responsible for disseminating the calls. This process happened very quickly. Shortly before the primaries, Steve Kramer, who had previously orchestrated the dissemination of a deepfaked political call in North Carolina, commissioned another person to create a deepfake recording to impersonate the voice of Biden. And when I say shortly before the primaries, I mean it. The New Hampshire primary election took place on January 23rd. Just 3 days before that, on January 20th, Kramer sent the person who made the call, a man named Paul Carpenter, the script, paid Carpenter on the same day. Carpenter later said that it cost him $1 in about 20 minutes to create this deep faked message. Kramer paid him $150 for it. The very next day, Life Corp and Lingo disseminated the calls, and they did so spoofing another number, specifically the number of the spouse of Kathy Sullivan, who's the former New Hampshire Democratic Party chair, who was at the time leading a public effort to ask Democrats to write President Biden's name in the primary. So the phone call actually also provided her personal phone number in the call itself as the number to call to be removed from future calls. She obviously had nothing to do with this and didn't know why she was getting these calls. So in other words, the message was very intentionally set up, spoken as if from President Biden, sent from a number associated with Ms. Sullivan to try to convince voters that the message is from people that voters should be able to trust with information about their voting rights. But then that message told voters not to vote, to save their vote for the November election, as if they only had one vote. They could vote in the primary or the general, but they can't have it both ways. So when voters get a call like this, they hear their president's voice telling them, don't vote. If you vote, you'll have given up your chance, your right to vote in the general election. For experienced voters, hopefully they're able to recognize these calls as a scam. But for a new voter, for someone who's voting for the first time, someone who's 18, someone who's a new citizen, or merely somebody who is trying to become more active in our democracy, what does it mean for them to hear the president's voice from a phone number associated with a trusted political figure saying, you have to choose. If you vote today, can't vote in November. So save your vote. Don't vote in a couple days, vote in November. That's a scary call to get. And so maybe these voters play it safe. Maybe they don't vote in the primaries. Maybe they vote on Tuesday and then they think they're not allowed to vote in November. That's the kind of messaging that is obviously extremely alarming for anybody who's interested in participation and safe and fair participation in our democracy. We also know that for the defendants, this has been a process. They're getting savvier with the technology and the messaging. They're actively trying to undermine voting and to frighten, threaten, and deceive voters into not exercising their right to vote. We are going to hear from Selena Stewart in a moment, Chief Counsel and Senior Director of Advocacy and Litigation at League of Women Voters, and she will obviously be able to speak more directly about the harm that this campaign has caused to her organization. But I want to emphasize the vital role that League of Women Voters plays in our democracy. They're committed to encouraging people to vote, to become consistent voters, to participate in our democracy, to be educated about their rights, about elections, about the ballot. And now the communities that they serve are facing this new threat and they're having to change course. And League of Women Voters is now shifting their scant resources to deal with this new threat. And it comes at the cost of all the other people they would otherwise be encouraging to vote, educating, helping them register, helping them learn their rights. And it's harmful to our democracy that this important organization is being pulled in this direction. It's harmful to our democracy that voters are questioning their right, are thinking they don't have the right to vote in this primary or in any election. And we know that it can happen again and it can happen fast. This process took a couple of days, and Kramer himself has stated publicly that it cost him about $500, and he boasted it had a $5 million result, right? So small, takes very little time, very little money, and it can do a lot to create real damage to our voters. So what do? Well, this lawsuit is one of the ways that we address it. There are laws in place that protect voters from precisely the threat that the robocall campaign poses to our clients and to all voters. There's Section 11B of the Voting Rights Act, which provides that no person shall intimidate, threaten, or coerce, or attempt to intimidate, threaten, or coerce any person from voting or attempting to vote. And there are also federal and New Hampshire state laws that protect people from the deceptive robocalls like those at issue here. And so our lawsuit is challenging the defendants and these robocalls under these laws. We're seeking to enjoin them from making calls before other primaries and, of course, before other elections in the future, because that is a serious risk that is posed to voters. And I have spoken a lot. I would love to hand it off to my colleagues.
Thank you. Yes, Courtney. Mark Herring's our next speaker. Thank you. You're on mute. Sorry.
Well, thank you, John and Courtney, and good morning to everyone on the call. Thank you so much for joining the briefing. I am honored to join the folks from the League of Women Voters and Free Speech for People, two organizations that are in the forefront of protecting our freedom to vote. There is no right more basic in our democracy than the right to participate in electing our political leaders. And it is essential that voters be able to exercise their right to vote, free from intimidation, threats, or coercion. Nevertheless, on January 21st, 2024, 2 days before the New Hampshire presidential primary, Steve Kramer, Lingo Telecom LLC, and Life Corporation sent thousands of robocalls to people they thought were likely Democratic voters. The robocalls were a deepfake, featuring a voice generated with artificial intelligence that simulated the voice of President Joe Biden. The recording sounded convincing and urged people not to vote in the upcoming primary in order to save their vote for the general election in November, so that voters would be reluctant to vote in the primary out of fear they would lose their right to vote in the November general election. And to add to the deception, at least some of the robocalls were spoofed using a personal phone number associated with a prominent former state party leader known to be a supporter of President Biden. And that is why today we filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court of New Hampshire to protect the right to vote, free from intimidation, threats, or coercion, which was unlawfully infringed upon as a result of the wrongful conduct, the deceitful conduct, and the unlawful conduct of Steve Kramer, Lingo Telecom LLC, and Life Corp. We are asking the court to declare their misconduct a violation of Section 11B of the Voting Rights Act and other federal and New Hampshire state laws. And we are asking the court for a permanent nationwide injunction enjoining them from ever engaging in this kind of misconduct again. This case is important because technology may evolve rapidly in new and amazing ways, like the development of artificial intelligence. The brazenness of bad actors may continue to surprise us. Deep-faking the voice of the President of the United States to try to suppress voter turnout, and spoofing a phone number of a prominent state party official to make the call seem more legit. But regardless of the means or tools employed, regardless of the brazenness of the bad actors who maliciously undermine the electoral process through intimidation, threats, or coercion, there are federal and state laws that prohibit it. And there are organizations like the League of Women Voters who will take action to protect our freedom to vote. And that sends a couple of very important messages. First, there could be serious legal consequences for engaging in this kind of misconduct. So it serves as a deterrent for others out there who might think about doing something similar. And second, it reminds voters that there are laws to protect them, to protect their right to vote free from intimidation, threats, or coercion, and that there are people out there like the League of Women Voters who will stand up to protect that right. As a former state attorney general, I know the danger that voter suppression can inflict on our democracy. We must hold accountable those who would abuse new technology to undermine our freedom to vote.
Thank you, Mark. And our final speaker is Selena Stewart, Chief Counsel at Legal and Voters of US, whom we're honored to represent in this litigation. Selena.
Thank you, John. Mark and Courtney have made my job very easy because they have already outlined what we're trying to do. So I just want to take this moment to say thank you to everyone who was able to join. And also, we are very grateful to Free Speech for the People and Akin Gump for representing us in this really important matter. And we brought this case because of what happened in New Hampshire and particularly the impact that it had on the League's work. So a big shout out to the League of Women Voters of New Hampshire State President Liz Tintorelli and the tireless effort that she does with the New Hampshire League voters to educate voters both before and on election day. So I was in New Hampshire on January 23rd for the primary. And what really stood out to me is not only the efforts that our state and local leagues take alongside administrators, but also just the incredible dedication and work of the election administrators and election workers who are everyday heroes who work to make sure that voters have seamless, efficient experience at the polls. And we were getting questions at the league, administrators were getting questions on site about whether they could and should vote. And it just caused chaos that's unnecessary. But we have to ask ourselves, in my opinion, should the league or should election workers who already work often 12 to 16-hour shifts to implement the election have the burden of overcoming an obstacle of a robocall? And the answer to that has to be a hard no. The robocall served to discourage participation and have voters second guess their ability to vote, and that should not happen. And so we live in this thing called democracy where voters should be encouraged to participate and not discouraged or intimidated to do so. And the reality is that voting requires preparation. It includes investigating political views and ideologies of candidates, running for office, hopefully using vote411.org or any voter education tool that's online, but also determining who's the best candidate per category to represent you and the needs of your family and community. And then it requires you to show up either on election day or in communities where you can vote earlier to execute or complete your ballot. And the idea that in the 11th hour, a call comes telling you that not to vote by the president, that sounds like the president of the United States. It disengages folks, but it also undermines any preparations that voters took to make that happen, to execute and show up to vote. And so to me, And for the league, that is such an egregious action, and it just has to stop. As voters, we show up and the candidate must do their work and their job of applying for this position. And so any bad actor who is working to discourage, undermine our elections should be a threat to all of us. Not just the folks who received that call, but to anyone who could be impacted in any part of the country. And so that's why the league is involved in this case. We work very hard all throughout the year, not just in election cycles, to make sure that voters have the information that they need. And when things like this happen, it makes us have to work double time to answer questions, to make sure people have the confidence in the elections, and it just shouldn't happen. And so I'm here today to answer any questions. And again, thank you all for being here, and also to Free Speech for the People and Akin Gump for representing us in this very important matter.
Thank you, Selena. So we're now able to open this up to questions. You can pose your questions in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and we can call on you. And we do have a couple questions from Juliet Fairley at Epic Times. I'll read them out together and then ask our speakers to address them. First, what involvement does defendant Kramer have with the GOP? What involvement do any of the defendants have with the GOP? And how did the robocalls impact the outcome of the New Hampshire primary? I'll just start by saying we're not making any allegations in this complaint that the defendants have any connection with the GOP, but Courtney, Mark, Selena, do you want to address any either of these questions further?
Just real quick, the league is a nonpartisan organization. We do not tell people how to vote. We provide people information to figure out who to vote for themselves. So it wouldn't matter whether or not this came from someone who's affiliated with either party. That does not matter to us, and that's not the purpose for us joining or wanting to file this litigation. It's because any voter whose right is undermined or discouraged or disenfranchised from the process is a problem. It undermines our work specifically.
Thank you. Mark, Courtney, do you want to add anything to that?
I think you and Selena both said it perfectly.
Great.
Great. And then on the question of the outcome to the New Hampshire primary, again, that is also, we're not alleging that this impacted the outcome, but the focus here is on protecting all voters' rights. Does anyone want to add further to that question?
The only thing I would add is that it can be very difficult to know what the impact is, because we do know that thousands of calls were made. People who recognize the calls as being deceptive, some of them were able to reach out. A lot of them know League of Women Voters. That's one of the reasons why they were so quickly able to recognize it as a deceptive call. But we don't know how many thousands of people didn't recognize it as a deceptive call, or at least didn't recognize it in time. In this situation, it was wonderful because there was a prompt response, both in the media and from leaders who were able to swiftly respond. So our hope is that many people were able to learn of the deception before it cost them their right to vote. But we don't have specific numbers on that. And certainly our concern moving forward is that as the technology gets better, it is going to be harder to identify these the deceptive calls from the accurate calls.
Great. Our next question is from Holly Raymer from the Associated Press in New Hampshire. She asks, given that this is new AI technology, have courts taken this up elsewhere before, or is this the first lawsuit of its kind? We believe it's the first lawsuit of its kind dealing with AI technology being abused in the election process, but does anyone want to add further to that?
There is another case where robocalls were at issue with efforts to undermine people's right to vote. In the cases, and I don't have the name of it at the top of my head, it's Wall, and I can find that and send it to you. But that is another case in which efforts were made to suppress the vote by sending robocalls with fraudulent information out to voters to discourage them from voting. The situation was different. There was not the use of AI technology to mimic a President Biden or another political figure. But there, unfortunately, while we're at the forefront of this, the concern is that there are going to be more situations of robocalls using deceptive practices to try to suppress the vote. And that's one of the things we're trying to get ahead of.
Mark,
Yeah, I would just add to that. While, yes, we think this is probably, the first of its kind, this type of lawsuit, given the technology that was used. But one of the points that I would like to underscore is that regardless of the technology that's used, regardless of the tools or the means that are used, it is still unlawful to intimidate, threaten, or coerce somebody who is trying to exercise their right to vote. And so there are laws that will prohibit this type of conduct, regardless of whether they use AI or any other tool to accomplish it.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Maggie Astor. Steve Kramer has attempted to defend himself by claiming he was trying to demonstrate the dangers of AI so politicians and regulators would take action. What is your response to this?
Well, it's appears very self-serving in the aftermath to hear that kind of a statement, and we'll certainly be testing it. But regardless of the motivation, the intent here was to suppress the vote and to threaten and coerce voters into not voting out of fear that they might lose their right to vote. And that's why we're bringing this case.
I just want to echo that. We cannot divorce intent from impact. And I think you can have they always say the path to heaven or hell is paved with good intentions, right? And so the fact that it was used and the message, it's hard for me to believe just because the actual context of the message, which was discouraging people from participating, wait till November. So in my mind, the average person would think that if you're sending a message impersonating the president with that type of message, that is likely to discourage and not encourage people to vote.
Thank you, Selena. Our next question is from Juliet again. Actually, two questions. What is at stake in this case that's relevant for others nationwide? And is there a criminal investigation? On the latter, we're aware that the New Hampshire Attorney General's office has opened up an inquiry in this matter. We are, of course, not part of that, but they are aware of this filing today. With respect to what is at stake in this case that's relevant for others nationwide, Courtney, do you want to start us off on that one?
Sure. Well, there's a few different layers of answer. One is that the lawsuit seeks to enjoin these defendants from making any robocalls of this nature in the future. We know that Steve Kramer has already made deceptive robocalls in at least one other state using AI technology. There is serious concern that they will try campaigns like this in other states, both during this primary season and before the general election and before a myriad of other elections that are going to be happening in this country this year, in future years. And so it's really imperative that we address the threat that these defendants are creating for voters. But the other hope of this lawsuit is that it will demonstrate to other people who might attempt similar campaigns that this is illegal, that there are parties out there like a League of Women Voters who are prepared to challenge this sort of illegal voter intimidation and these illegal deceptive practices, hopefully make them think twice before they do the same. And if that's not if they don't think twice, or if they do and do it anyway, ideally there will be a good decision in this case that other courts can look to when faced with similar challenges elsewhere. But we are aware that as the technology comes out, as my colleague Mark mentioned, there might be some bad actors looking to abuse technology like this. And when the attempt is made to threaten voters, to deceive voters, it's really important to be ready to challenge that because the attacks are going to happen quickly. And we want to be prepared for that, because once somebody loses their right to vote, it's gone, right? If there was somebody who did not vote in the primaries because of this call, they can't get that back. They can't make it up. That's just gone. And so it's very important that we're working as quickly as possible to make sure that doesn't happen to voters, that they don't, lose their right to vote because of a deceptive or threatening message like this one.
Thank you, Mark. And Selena, do you want to add to any of that?
Courtney took all the words.
She said it very well. I would just add, in addition to the deterrent effect that would help keep elections in other states safer. It also reminds voters that there are laws to protect against this, and that they can feel safe exercising their freedom to vote.
Thank you. We have no further questions. Selena, do you want to just close us out with any remaining remarks?
Yeah, just thank you again for joining us. We do think this is a really important case, not only because it happened in New Hampshire, but looking ahead to 2024 and really making sure, like Courtney just mentioned, is there's no recourse when they're successful with this. And so we just want to make sure that as many people can participate in the election as possible. And so with this case, we're hoping to achieve that. So thank you to everybody.
Thank you all for joining us, and you can stay updated on this case at our website at freespeechforpeople.org, as well as the League's website. And we look forward to keeping you updated. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.